December 17th, 1944. A little-known American brigadier general steps out of a jeep in St. Vith and walks into a command post where the front is already cracking. The German offensive has been running for one day, and the enemy needs this town fast because 7 roads run through it. Over the next week, this general builds a defense from almost nothing, uses movement to make a small force feel huge, and delays the main German push long enough for the Allies to stabilize. The town eventually falls, but the timetable breaks, the offensive bleeds out, and decades later the German commander admits he thought he was fighting something far bigger. The general's name is Bruce C. Clarke. Now rewind. Most people think of the winter offensive as one story, one famous pocket, one famous line, but wars rarely hinge on the famous moments. They hinge on logistics, road nets, and minutes you cannot replace once they are spent. This German offensive had a name and a purpose, but its logic was simple. Hit hard, move fast, split the Allied front, reach key objectives before the Allies can shift reserves. That is why the first days mattered more than the later ones. If the attacker loses tempo early, the whole plan starts paying interest on delay. That is also why St. Vith mattered. It sat on a knot of roads that controlled movement west. If German divisions could push through this junction quickly, armor and trucks could fan out, bypass resistance, and keep rolling. If the junction stayed blocked, the offensive didn't just slow. It jammed behind itself. In the Ardennes, narrow roads don't forgive traffic, they punish it. The German main effort ran through Ardennes, and among the attacking forces, the strongest spearhead belonged to Fifth Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel. His orders were explicit. Take St. Vith quickly. The plan assumed the town would fall early and the road network would become German arteries pumping the offensive forward. That was the plan on paper. On the ground, by the afternoon of December 17th, the schedule was already slipping. Part of it was American resistance in unexpected places. Part of it was the forest itself. Narrow routes, heavy vehicles, and competing priorities create the kind of bottleneck no commander can wish away. When armor can't move freely, it becomes predictable. And when it becomes predictable, it becomes vulnerable. Inside the American lines, the situation around St. Vith was turning ugly fast. At the command post, Alan W. Jones looked like a man watching his own map get erased. His 106th Infantry Division had been in the line for days before the offensive hit. Many of the men had little combat experience. Now 2 of his regiments were surrounded on the ridge east of town. Communications were failing. German armor was finding seams, slipping through places infantry could not seal quickly enough. Jones told the visitor he had thrown in his last chips. The visitor had not come here for heroics. Clarke's combat command, part of 7th Armored Division, had been moving through the area on what should have been a routine movement. Nothing glamorous, nothing urgent. Then he walked into Jones's command post and realized something that felt impossible only a day earlier. There was no routine. Further east was German. Jones told him. Bluntly, that St. Vith had to be held and Clarke was now responsible for the defense. Clarke tried to explain what any sane person would explain. His combat command was still on the road, slowed by traffic. The roads were clogged with retreating soldiers and civilians trying to escape the fighting. His tanks and armored infantry were not yet in place. It didn't matter. Jones had nothing else to give. The handover was informal, the way crises often are. No polished orders, no perfect briefing, just the transfer of a problem that was too big for the man currently holding it. Clarke stepped outside into the snow and looked east. Somewhere in the forest, German columns were grinding closer and time was leaking away. He had only a few men with him at the moment, plus a radio, plus the authority that comes with rank. And he had a town that mattered far more than it looked like it should. He also understood something important. The Germans were already behind schedule. That meant they were under pressure. Pressure makes commanders do predictable things, and predictable things can be exploited. What the German side did not recognize was the identity of the man now sitting in their way. Clarke wasn't famous. He didn't cultivate reporters. He didn't build a personal legend. He was the kind of commander who focused on outcomes and let the publicity drift elsewhere. But he had something more useful than fame. He had a method. Months earlier in Lorraine, Clarke's unit had faced the same German commander. In tank fighting that punished anyone who stayed still, Clarke refused to build a neat static line and wait for the blow. Instead, he built what he called a mobile defense. Small groups of tanks moving between firing positions, striking and disappearing, forcing the enemy to keep guessing where the real strength was. The value of that approach wasn't only the vehicles it destroyed. It was the uncertainty it created. If you cannot see the boundaries of the force in front of you, you tend to assume the boundaries are larger than they are. If you cannot pin down its center of gravity, you start treating every contact like it might be the main one. That is the mindset Clarke wanted to force on the Germans at St. Vith, because he did not have enough men to win by brute strength. He could win by shaping the enemy's perception. While his main units were still arriving, Clarke began grabbing anything that could hold a rifle. Engineers, headquarters staff, stragglers, anyone who could stand on a road and slow a probe. He placed these scratch groups on the approaches into town, not to stop an armored army, but to buy time in small increments. Minutes become hours when you force the enemy to deploy. Hours become days if you keep doing it. Late on December 17th, the core of his force began arriving. Tanks, armored infantry, engineers, artillery, roughly 2,500 men when fully assembled, give or take the chaos of traffic and combat against a major German push. It wasn't much, but Clarke didn't need an army. He needed the enemy to act like he had one. He organized immediately. No sleep, little reconnaissance. Decisions driven by map study and instinct built from years of armored warfare. He placed units near key junctions with routes planned behind them so they could move without turning every fallback into panic. Then he made the choice that separated him from a conventional defense. He did not dig in and wait. A static line would be found. A static line would be targeted. A static line would be overwhelmed once German artillery and armor were focused against it. Clarke knew that if he tried to build a wall, the Germans would simply figure out where the wall was weakest and punch through. Instead, he built a shadow that looked like a wall. Small armored teams, short engagements, sudden shifts, hit hard, then move. Let the enemy feel contact and then lose it. Force German commanders to spend time confirming what they think they see. He was building a defense that used movement as its main weapon. December 18th brought the first serious contact. German infantry moved down the approaches expecting thin resistance. They ran into Shermans firing from concealed positions. Lead vehicles were knocked out. The American tanks then displaced before artillery could settle in and tear them apart. Not long after, those same tanks appeared on another road and struck a different German column from the side. To the German units on the ground, this felt like being attacked by a force that could be anywhere. It felt like the Americans had armor spread across the sector in depth. To German staff officers trying to interpret reports, it looked worse. They saw armor on multiple approaches. They saw counterattacks from unexpected directions. They saw contact, then disappearance, then contact again somewhere else. They did what Clarke expected them to do. They assumed there was more. That assumption flowed upward and reached Manteuffel, and it mattered because Manteuffel's original plan depended on speed. A quick seizure of St. Vith, a clean pass-through, westward movement maintained. But if St. Vith was defended by a larger force than expected, a quick pass-through could become a trap, so Manteuffel adjusted. That adjustment was Clarke's real early victory. Instead of racing through, the Germans began preparing a deliberate assault. They pulled strength toward St. Vith. They allocated time and attention to cracking what they believed was a substantial position. Every unit focused on St. Vith was a unit not moving west. Every hour spent preparing was an hour given back to the Allies. On December 19th, the situation worsened dramatically. The surrounded regiments of the 106th surrendered on the ridge. Thousands of American soldiers went into captivity. Clarke's flank protection dissolved. Open space appeared around him like a wound. German forces flowed around St. Vith on both sides, pushing west while Clarke held the town and the road hub increasingly isolated. This is the moment where a rational commander starts thinking withdrawal. Outnumbered, threatened from multiple directions, flanks collapsing, supply lines narrowing, Clarke stayed, not because he believed in heroic last stands, because he understood the operational value of delay. He pulled his most exposed positions inward. He tightened the perimeter around what mattered most, the junction itself. He accepted that he could not hold everything. Holding everything would mean holding nothing because it would stretch his men too thin. He chose to hold enough to keep the roads blocked. That choice kept the German timetable bleeding. And this is where the battle becomes not only tactical but strategic. Because while Clarke held the junction, Allied commanders elsewhere gained time to react. Forces shifted. New lines formed. A response that would have been impossible on day 1 became possible on day 5. The German High Command understood delay as danger, and Adolf Hitler took delay personally. When he learned the schedule was slipping by days, he sent a unit intended to smash obstacles. The Führer Brigade was not a normal formation. It carried political weight as well as firepower, and it arrived with a commander known for ruthless efficiency, Otto Ernst Remer. Fresh troops and armor joined the assault on Clarke's perimeter on December 20th. Clarke felt the pressure spike. Attacks became heavier. Artillery became more punishing. His men were exhausted. Ammunition stocks fell. Every casualty hurt more because there were no easy replacements. This was the reality inside the perimeter. No rest, cold that gnawed through clothing, foxholes that froze into concrete. The kind of fatigue that makes even loading a magazine feel like lifting metal. Clarke knew he could not keep the same perimeter forever, not with a shrinking force and increasing pressure. So on December 21st, he made a defining decision. He contracted again into what later became known as a fortified goose egg, an oval perimeter centered on the western approaches. The logic was simple. Shorter lines, tighter spacing, faster response to penetrations, fewer gaps for the enemy to exploit. Every yard given up felt like defeat, but Clarke was not defending ground for pride. He was defending time. He packed the force into the smallest defensible shape and ordered it to hold. At higher levels, coordination and authority shifted. Roman 18 Airborne Corps under Matthew Ridgway was now deeply involved in the sector. Logistics and political coordination were handled by division leadership, including Robert W. Hasbrouck. Clarke remained focused on the fight itself, the minute-by-minute decisions that kept the perimeter intact. Inside the goose egg, the defense became a grind. Tank crews ran partial ammunition loads. Infantry stayed in the same positions without rotation. Engineers laid mines and then fought with rifles. Men who weren't supposed to be in the line filled gaps because the line did not care what your job title was. One exposed sector was held by elements of 87th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. They had arrived small. They became smaller. Leadership thinned. The line kept firing anyway because the alternative was collapse. Clarke moved constantly. He did not sit in a warm room and issue orders from distance. He lived close to the perimeter, often in his jeep, driving to threatened sectors, checking units, directing fire, shifting whatever reserves existed. And the truth was, reserves barely existed. He was pulling men from quiet spots and throwing them into breaches, gambling that the quiet spots would remain quiet long enough. This is the kind of command where too aggressive costs, not as a slogan, as a warning. Push too hard at the wrong place, and you lose the ability to respond at the right one. Clarke's defense was aggressive in movement but conservative in what it risked. Short fights, controlled withdrawal, sudden counters, a constant effort to deny the enemy a clean target. The Germans kept hitting. The perimeter bent and held until it didn't. December 22nd brought the heaviest coordinated pressure. Infantry, armor, artillery working in combination. Shells tore through positions. Assaults pushed into the edges. Tanks pressed through snow and wreckage. The goose egg buckled. Penetrations formed. The line fractured in places. Clarke moved, redirected, plugged gaps, but the strain was reaching the limit. Pause 1 second. This is the beat where it feels like it becomes one of two outcomes. Either the defenders break and are swallowed, or they execute something disciplined enough to survive. By nightfall, the eastern side was collapsing. German troops were inside the perimeter. The road hub that had been blocked for days was about to be lost. Higher headquarters made the decision. Withdraw. Clarke had bought the time. Now he had to save what could still be saved. December 23rd, the withdrawal began under pressure. This wasn't a chaotic retreat. It was a controlled retrograde movement, the hardest kind, because you have to move backward without letting the enemy realize you're moving until it's too late. Clarke's plan depended on deception. Vehicles pulled out gradually on the western side while a rear guard kept firing. The rear guard simulated a full defensive line. Machine guns fired from positions that were already being evacuated. Mortars dropped rounds from known locations with small crews. Enough noise, enough flashes, enough fire to keep German commanders convinced the whole force was still present. When the Germans finally recognized the movement, much of Clarke's command had already slipped through the narrowing corridor to the west. The rear guard pulled out last. Not everyone made it. Some positions were overrun before they could disengage. But the bulk of the force escaped intact enough to reform behind a new line. They carried vehicles, wounded, and what cohesion they could preserve. St. Vith fell, but it fell late. 7 days after it was expected to fall fast, and that delay broke the German timetable in a way that could not be repaired. By Christmas Eve, messages upward from Manteufel's level reflected a hard truth. The plan depended on speed, and speed was gone. Fuel had been burned in traffic and fighting. Time had been spent on an obstacle that should not have existed. The offensive's internal clock had been destroyed. While Clarke held St. Vith, Allied responses elsewhere had time to become real. Forces shifted to stabilize shoulders. Countermoves formed. The defensive posture hardened. What began as a shock became a contest. That is why St. Vith matters even if it isn't the most famous name. The battle's popular legend tends to revolve around Bastogne and the surrounded defenders who refused to break because it is dramatic and easy to remember. But St. Vith was not a side story. It was a road hub the main effort depended on. St. Vith was the choke point the Germans needed open to keep the offensive flowing. Clarke held that choke point for 7 days, and almost nobody learned his name. After the war, the loudest stories belonged to the commanders who became symbols. Clarke did not become a symbol. He did not write himself into the spotlight. He did the job and moved on. 2 decades later, in 1965, a documentary crew brought the former enemies together. Clarke and Manteuffel sat across a table, old men now, no longer living inside the weather of that week. Manteuffel told Clarke something that clarified the entire fight. German intelligence had estimated they were fighting an entire American corps at St. Vith. Not a combat command, not 2,500 men. A corps. That was the effect of Clarke's mobile defense. 2 tank companies moving like a larger formation, striking and shifting, shaping perception, forcing caution, forcing delay. Manteuffel's conclusion was simple. The defense of St. Vith didn't just delay the German plan, it spoiled it. Clarke listened quietly. That was his style. No victory lap, no demand for applause. He never built a celebrity identity. He never tried to become the face of the Bulge. But his men knew what happened. The tank crews knew. The recon survivors knew. The engineers who laid mines and then fought with rifles knew. And the enemy commander knew. Sometimes that is the cleanest proof a soldier ever gets. Not a headline, not a statue. Just the admission years later that one man with almost nothing forced a powerful army to waste the one resource it could not replenish. Time. St. Vith cost blood, cold, and exhaustion, but it bought the survival of a front. Which part of his story stayed with you?